Hello and welcome back to the Eau Rouge podcast. And Chris, I think we've got to get straight into it today because the rivalry, the championship has now come to a head, and it's come to a head at Silverstone, one of our favourite tracks, and it's come to a head between Hamilton and Verstappen. I'm sure everybody's seen it by now. Hamilton essentially has taken Verstappen off at Copse Corner, and Hamilton not only was part of that incident and also got a penalty, but then went on to win the race. So let's get started with this. Whose fault was it?
It was nobody's fault. Like, it just wasn't. Did Hamilton go wide? Yes. Did he do it on purpose? Probably not. Did Verstappen turn in on him? Probably. Did either of them mean for that to happen? No. Just go back 25 years and look at the fact that that would happen on a really regular basis, not always between title deciders, but two aggressive drivers refusing to yield ends up with these things happening. And everyone's like, oh, well, Hamilton should have just slowed down. But like, why would you? It was nip and tuck. He knew he had to get ahead of the Red Bull before Maggots and Beckett's. And if he just gave up, and just let Verstappen through, everyone would be slating him for that. So what's he going to do? There is absolutely no way he knew he was going to pitch him into the barriers at 57G, which is why his punishment was relatively lenient. I think he was unlucky to get it in the first place, but apparently the wider internet completely disagrees.
Well, listen, there's two things that you brought up in there which I think are really important, and I agree with you as well. And whatever the internet has to say, they can say it in the comments down below in this video, because I also think it was a racing incident. I think that there's two important things you said there. One was yielding, right? Now, this is what you're going to get when you get two championship rivals going against each other, when you get two stubborn drivers like Hamilton and Verstappen. When you're going into Copse Corner, one of the fastest corners in Formula One, you have two drivers like that, neither of them are going to yield. So there's a racing incident is going to occur. If you look at Hamilton's two passes later on in the race, same corner on Norris and Leclerc, in both of those, Norris and Leclerc yielded. Right, Leclerc probably less so because he went wide and he kind of lost it and went a bit wide. But essentially, Hamilton was through. Leclerc did not turn in on him. Right. So you've got Verstappen, who is always going to turn in, always, regardless of who's there, right? And then you've got Hamilton, who is always going to go for that gap. And you've got that there. And I just think that when it comes to this, if Hamilton is not going to go for that position, essentially what he's doing is he's not just giving up the lead of the race, he's giving up the race win. Because we know that the Red Bull is faster than the Mercedes at this point of the season. And obviously things can change throughout a race, but if Verstappen was ahead into Maggots and Beckett's, he was probably going to start pulling away on the straight and then the hangar straight and then into Stowe, and then that's it. He's gone because he will. He just scamper off into the distance. The second thing you mentioned there was about penalties. And I'm starting to get a bit worried now. I mentioned it 2 weeks ago in Austria, and I think now that we're coming to this point again, is where the racing feels a bit sanitized. If you don't, I watched Christian Horner's comments after the race, and he said that Hamilton, who is as experienced as he is, should not be attempting a pass at Copse Corner like that. If that's the case, what's the point in Copse Corner? It's a fast corner where you can build up enough speed coming out of left field to gain on your opponent and go for a pass at high speed. That's what Formula One is about. Obviously, I have to kind of offset this with the fact that Verstappen did get hurt, and it's really important to point out that the safety of the drivers does come first. But Formula One is about risks. That's why they race, is because you can get hurt. Is one of those things, whether it's your fault or not, it can get hurt. And the problem is, if we're giving out penalties for these things, if we're giving out penalties for Norris's, for Perez and all of that kind of stuff in Austria, and we're giving out penalties for George Russell in the sprint race, where I thought that was the cruelest of them all, and then we're giving these penalties out for Hamilton, then this is going to lead to the sterile racing that Formula One is deliberately trying to avoid. It's a very strange contradiction, I think.
Yeah, I don't think I could have put it any differently, really. I think you summed it up really nicely. And I saw Verstappen on social media saying that it was unpleasant to see Hamilton celebrating the way he did. But Hamilton leapt out of the car, ran off to celebrate. And I don't think anybody really expected Verstappen to have had to go to hospital. I don't even really like Verstappen necessarily expected to go to hospital. Generally now, a driver has a big shunt, goes to the medical centre, and barring really rare one-offs like Grosjean, is just released. Like, how was Hamilton to know that had happened? So yeah, with the full picture, perhaps it does look a little unsavoury, but given everything else that had just happened, I don't see how he'd be in possession of the information. And if he heard that he'd hospitalised Verstappen, I'm sure that he wouldn't have celebrated the way that he did. But like, he just won a British Grand Prix, the first race in years now, because it's been 18 months really that's had that atmosphere. He's going to go for it. And yeah, it's just controversy, isn't it? But I think we can probably agree that this will be the point where the Hamilton Verstappen rivalry stops being as pleasant as it was and begins to take on that harder edge that all those championship battles take on when it gets serious, whether it was Hamilton Rosberg, whether it was Verstappen Webber, whether it was Hamilton Alonso, Schumacher Hill, Senna Prost, Villeneuve Pironi, even. When the gloves come off and it really starts to matter, that's when we see a breakdown in relationships. But it's not really a surprise, is it? I don't think it's a noteworthy, oh, this is the first time this has ever happened. Like, it just happens in Formula One. These are all Formula One things happening in a really Formula One sort of way. So why everyone is getting so het up about it, I'm not entirely sure.
It's one of those things that if it didn't happen, we would be complaining of another boring Verstappen win. We'd be complaining about how Formula One is sterile. Championship rivals collide with each other because they are so competitive and unwilling to yield. And this is the thing. I'm in no way blaming Verstappen for this accident, because I do think that if you have to put somebody at fault, then it probably would be Hamilton, because you could argue that Verstappen was just about ahead going into Copse, or enough ahead. But he turned in. When you turn into a corner, and as many drivers, many commentators say in the past, when you turn into somebody, they can't just disappear. And I know that Hamilton could back out, but he's not going to. He's a world champion for a reason. Verstappen's not going to back out either. Why? Like, just because I know that Max got hurt, and this is why I think what's causing so much controversy. But if he hadn't got hurt, if it had just been, jumped out the barrier, and that's fine. This is a rivalry that has now been sparked, which is what we see every single time. And I know maybe it's not as dangerous. Maybe other collisions coming together has not been quite as dangerous as this one potentially, but it happens. This is what we want from the sport. We don't want people getting hurt, but we want two drivers not to yield to each other. We want to see them crash, baby.
Realistically, and like, I probably agree with Aidan Millward that the whole "if you no longer go for a gap that exists and you are like not a racing driver" thing is a bit of a hackneyed cliche and often used to justify clumsy overtakes that go wrong. But I don't think this was a clumsy overtake that went wrong. I think this was somebody going for a narrow gap, and a gap nowhere near as narrow as when he went down the inside on the straight, by the way. He was really squeezing into there. That, to me, seems like a much more risky attempt to get past. And it was a very, valiant block from Verstappen that sadly went wrong. I think a lot of people online suggest that Hamilton deliberately turned into him. But I feel like if you actually watch footage of several times that's happened in F1 history, it's very obvious. The stewards have all the data. They gave him 10 seconds, I think, for a reason. It's also worth noting that the stewards panel for this weekend, that for some reason I was perusing before the race weekend began, is mostly consistent of lawyers, sporting lawyers that love motor racing and have taken part themselves. But it's a genuine legal team. It's not like a bunch of British politicians sitting there deciding to protect the golden boy at home. People had a look at it, analysed all the data, analysed all the angles. And let's remember, we had Toto and Christian going absolutely berserk, running upstairs, trying to like pull one over on the other one. I'm sure they had every single piece of available data to support both arguments, and what they decided was 10-second penalty. I'm sure Red Bull are fuming that 10 seconds wasn't enough to hold off Hamilton, but I don't think really 15, 20 laps in the end, we really saw that monumental charge working out the way that it did. I wasn't convinced it would happen until they were alongside, ironically, going into Cops. And then I realised that was it. It was going to happen. But it's just feelings are running high. But I think that a lot of newer fans of the sport will be convinced that this was Jerez 1997 without having any idea what Jerez 1997 was. And I don't really like to pull the "you don't know what you're talking about, you haven't been supporting F1 long enough" card. But I do think it's salient at like this juncture to discuss the fact that we have seen people turning on title rivals. We have seen much more bitter, cynical. Istanbul 2010, I also think an incredibly cynical refusal to yield that wasn't the case here. Like, and it can be hyped, and it will be hyped up, like the way that F1 media runs now, and Netflix will be straight in there, dramatized. They put 15 minutes between the sound of impact and the confused noises coming out of Verstappen's car on the radio, which were pretty bad already, if I'm honest. I don't think they need any dramatization, but yet people are going to dramatize it. But the real winner here is the World Drivers' Championship is now back in contention, isn't it? It is alive again. Just as Verstappen was beginning to run away, he had an awful piece of luck. Be interesting to see if he's able to race in Hungary, because concussions can be quite serious. They can have medium to long-term effects. Will that be the case? Because I think it's unusual now for drivers to be taken to hospital for, a period of several hours. But I do think that this will define the season, that moment where they touch and Verstappen spears into the barrier. But it's also overshadowing from an incredible second pace drive, isn't it? Charles Leclerc today, brilliant, really good. Can't believe he managed to hold on to the lead for all but about 3 laps of the race.
Yeah, so one thing I just finally want to say about the Hamilton and Verstappen collision is that to me it feels like I have been watching all weekend, especially Alonso doing it, but plenty of others weaving around the straights, which I find far more dangerous than an attempt going up into Cops, because you don't like if you're too busy looking in your mirrors even when you're weaving, then you're going to be not focusing on what's going on in front of you. If you're too busy focusing on what's going in front of you trying to weave, you're not going to see who's coming up behind you. Verstappen attempted to weave on the Wellington straight because Hamilton got a better run. The only difference was when Verstappen moved to the inside, Hamilton was fast enough to go around the outside and actually nearly overtook him going into Brooklyn. So I found that a bit more dangerous. And I also think, like what you mentioned about this, not maybe people who have not been watching Formula One for long enough, there is a bit of an outrage culture, I suppose you could say, in Formula One that's been coming around for the last few years. So where we're so desperate to be furious about something, so desperate to put blame on people, and to kind of say, well, Hamilton's been dominating for so long that he must be getting favoured in some way. And well, Red Bull are dominating this season, so the FIA must be doing something to ensure that we have more competition, in legal terms, in favoritism. And I think that it's a dangerous rhetoric to start getting into that, because what you're doing is starting to eliminate the fact that this is a competition and that these people are fighting, and that there's going to be cases where somebody is better than somebody else, somebody's going to make a mistake, and title rivals will collide. And like you said, it's not Schumacher into Villeneuve. You can see him turning the steering wheel the opposite way to attempt to take his title rival out of the World Championship. He was excluded from the World Championship for doing that. And this is not the same thing, like you said. But yeah, let's get on to some, because it was a good race overall, actually. After the incident happened, there were some very interesting moments. Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari had pace, despite the fact that Leclerc's engine was cutting out throughout the beginning of the race. He was holding Hamilton off initially. Sainz was also doing very well until his disastrous pit stop. It seems like the heat is really having an effect on some of these, whether it's the wheel guns or the wheel nuts, whatever it is. The heat seems to have a huge effect. But yeah, Leclerc did very well, and he only ended up losing the lead. What was it, lap 49, I think? So three laps before the end. Ferrari seem to. I say this every time. Like if Ferrari have a good result, it's like, oh, they seem to have changed something. Something's recovered, and then they have a run of terrible racing, and it's like, oh, it's happened again. But Leclerc, I think this was rather than a Ferrari drive. This was a Leclerc drive who did really well.
Yes. Yeah, I think it was him reminding everybody that he is still here. He is still a really exciting prospect for the future, and that we do need to sit up and take notice of him, which it was hard to avoid today, really, wasn't it? I don't think there was anyone watching today that wasn't impressed. Sainz, unlucky, but Leclerc just looked good. And yeah, okay, once hammer time began, you did feel perhaps it was a matter of time till the black and turquoise car was bearing down upon him. But the rest of it, he just keeping them out of range. There were definitely points, I think, where all of us thought didn't see a Ferrari win happening today. I know I definitely did. Also a great drive from Norris back into third in the championship, edging ahead of Bottas despite finishing behind, interestingly. Bottas, another man who had a pretty good day, had circumstances been different, might have found himself higher up. Perhaps you feel if he'd not ruined his tyres in Hamilton's position at the top of the pile, which would, I think, have made it interesting to see if people were still complaining so strongly about the Verstappen collision. But cynicism aside, there were some strong performances. Lance Stroll finishing 8th. That was pretty coming in clutch at the end there.
Yeah.
Really good weekend for Alpine, the world's most inconsistent team. They seem to have taken French sporting performances to heart, and a brilliant one week and just non-existent the next. Strong. I mean,
Alonso's start in the sprint race really was a sight to behold, wasn't it? On that first lap, he set off from, I can't quite remember where he had qualified for it. I think it was 11th or 12th, and managed to get up to 5th or 6th in the first lap. If you see the clip and you're on board with him, it's a beautiful opening lap. It's one of the greatest I think that I've seen for a very, very long time, and that set him up for the weekend. Really, he only lost 2 places during the sprint race after that. But obviously, yeah, like you said, Alpine are very up and down this year, and they'll continue to be, I imagine, for foreseeable future.
Yeah, well, at least they're there to surprise us on occasion, which is always nice to see. And it was a strong enough performance that Perez, who I thought perhaps would have a barnstorming performance from the back, as he so often loves to do, just couldn't get past. He got stuck on a DRS train, and that was the end of the second Red Bull. So I think he probably, despite the pit lane start, would have hoped for a better time this week. But I think the brilliance from Alpine, strong performance as well from both Alpha Tauris, and an unexpectedly great Ferrari showing just kept him out of it. Try as much as he might, he just wasn't getting into the points. He did manage to steal, of course, the point for fastest lap, and while he didn't earn it himself, he did manage to prevent Hamilton from scoring it, which in a title battle that is this close could prove to be crucial. Cynical strategy from Red Bull, but I'm sure that they won't be complaining.
No, they're not going to pull any punches now, are they? After what happened in that collision, and have we seen that before? Have we ever seen a driver sacrifice, like, because if he's not in the top 10, have we ever seen him take the fastest lap just to prevent anybody else from getting it?
No, but then I suppose it's only been with us for a season and a half. So the concept of point for fastest lap hasn't had long enough to generate or have been relevant, because you couldn't really have seen Albon get the fastest lap, could you?
Yeah.
You did have these moments where if a driver clearly wasn't going to win, they'd pit, get super softs and go out and blast it. But it wasn't the deliberate spitefulness of getting the fastest lap just so someone else couldn't have it.
Yeah. Now, I to be honest, I thought this was going to be our biggest talking point of the weekend, which is the sprint race, which obviously was tried out for the first time this weekend in Formula One. I think we've got it in 2 more weekends after this one, and I have an opinion on it. And I think that opinion is that I don't particularly like it. I'm not saying that it was bad. I don't think that it was awful in terms of to watch. I don't think it was awful. And it didn't have too much of an effect on the race, which I was a bit worried about on Saturday evening, because I was sort of thinking, well, what the sprint race has done is effectively put everybody in race order. So when they start the race on Sunday, there's not going to be as many overtakes because, they're in race order. And that sort of didn't come about too much because of the Hamilton and Verstappen collision and various other things as well. So maybe that didn't quite come to fruition, which was a good thing. But I'm not sure why they keep trying to change the qualifying format, because when you watch it, especially when you watch it at home, now I understand, like, for race day fans, for those who go to the races, the sprint race does provide far more action than qualifying. And I've been there on a race weekend, and I can imagine that a sprint race would be far more entertaining, because that's why we watch Formula One. We watch it for the races. But the qualifying, when you're actually watching it, is very, very exciting this season, I think in the past as well, because we really genuinely often don't know who's going to get pole. Verstappen's not got as many poles this season as he has race wins. So it's a case of, like, really kind of thinking, does this sprint race really improve? Does it make the race weekend better for everybody? And I'm not convinced it really is much of an improvement. I don't know what you think.
No, I agree. And I think actually it was quite a good qualifying session, which makes us that we had a stunner of a result from George Russell. We had Hamilton snatch back pole from an otherwise dominant Verstappen. We had a good Ferrari showing. We had Perez getting in there enough that he could run interference for Red Bull if needs be. And apart from the Leclerc position, we lost all of that. Verstappen won the sprint race, unsurprisingly. Perez DNF'd and therefore had to start from the pit lane. Obviously, Russell was tragically penalised, and despite finishing 9th, which is still a place lower than he qualified, he slipped all the way down, which killed any chance of points this weekend. Yeah. And I just didn't see the point in it. Nothing tangibly interesting happened. So why did we do it? Like, what was the point?
Well, what worries, I think it's here to stay, because I think Ross Brawn has been a big, he's been one to push this lot. And after the race, he was talking about it, as if it was this kind of wonderful, new, ingenious thing that we've done. And I sort of think, well, and Ross Brawn is not a man who's going to be convinced easily in the other way. So he thinks it was a successful race, and therefore I think we're going to see it quite a few more times next season, if not every race weekend. But like I said, I can't see the vast improvement. Like, when we switched from the old qualifying sessions, which they've been playing around with for a number of years before they settled on the one we've got now, they had some strange time where they had aggregate times. There was even, I can't remember what year it was, but it was early 2000s. We had a qualifying on Sunday morning, and they took that aggregate time with what there was on Saturday. We had the one-lap shootouts. We had just the hour sessions, which we used to have. That was the kind of dominant format before they started to change it all. And we've settled on this one. When it changed from whatever format it was in 2004 or 5, to the one we've got now, it really did improve it. There was a drastic improvement. Then they tried to fiddle around with it again with the 90-second rule, where they tried to eliminate whenever that was, 2016, 17, where they tried to eliminate everybody. They realized that was awful and went back to the original version. And if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Simple as that, I think.
Yes, it should probably be mentioned, this is not actually the first sprint qualifying in Formula One history. That particular honour goes to the 1959 German Grand Prix at Abbas, where drivers competed in 2 heats with their aggregate finishing positions deciding their starting place for the race the next day. And that never caught on, which says to me it was a useless idea, and traditional qualifying was more exciting. And I think the issue with traditional qualifying is the same issue that we actually have with wider F1, which is if you let teams become too dominant, they will do something like dominate qualifying. And we've seen the pendulum swing this year, and Red Bull have become the dominant ones. But I think the issue is with inequality in the sport, not with the format itself, and how you choose to address inequality in the sport. If you even think that's necessarily a bad thing, it's a different conversation. I'm just not sure that sprint qualifying brings anything new to the table apart from an extra race to televise and more advertising to sell, which must absolutely have been a consideration in the planning. But outside of sprint qualifying, a particularly contentious crash and a great recovery, is there much else to talk about? No points for Russell again, despite a brilliant qualifying because he was denied by the format. Mazepin finished in front of Schumacher today. Is Schumacher delivering on the promise? Are we just clutching at straws to fill up the rest of the podcast? Who can say?
That's a good point, though. At what point do we start? Do we start saying that these two need to do more, or especially Schumacher needs to do more?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are very few people that are going to say Mazepin should be doing better outside of being a rolling chicane. He got over the nerves and I think the easy spills at the start of the season. And while we're not going to point to him as a star of the future, I think we can reasonably comfortably say he is safe enough in the sport now. But you do expect more from Michael Schumacher. This isn't a Bruno Senna situation where he's cashing in on his uncle's name, or like a Jacques Villeneuve senior moment where your brother, or Ralph Schumacher, a more obvious comparison. Mick Schumacher is in this sport because he's Michael Schumacher's son. Michael Schumacher, one of the greatest drivers of all time. Mick is fully expected to emulate him to some degree. We're certainly looking at him as being part of the third father-son world championship team. And am I impressed? Not really. I know he's in a useless car and we aren't expecting him to be fighting for points, but we might be expecting him not to finish behind Mazepin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's probably where, because the only person you can judge him against is his teammate at this moment. And his teammate has before the season even started, his teammate had garnered a reputation as somebody who was maybe not going to be taken as seriously as he could be in the sport. And now he's finishing behind him. So I think it's noteworthy. I don't think it's any time to start going, Schumacher's not good enough, blah, blah, blah. But I think that it's something that, we should definitely file away for later and maybe just bring up a bit later in the season, depending on the results that are left to come.
But I think that's a fair analysis of the situation, probably.
And I think that's it. Well, thank you so much for listening again. The championship has been blown wide open yet again this season. Thank you to everybody who's been listening so far. This 2021 season has turned out to be almost like the perfect time to start a podcast, I think. And it's been the face. So in 2 weeks' time, I believe we go to Hungary on the 30th to the 1st of August, and we hope to see you then. Thank you so much for listening. Please hit like and share and subscribe and leave your comments. What do you think about the collision today between Verstappen and Hamilton? Please let us know. Thank you very much for listening.